Welcome year 11, welcome to lesson 5 in your 10 lesson unit. Now I know that you're not used to seeing me in this class with you, but Miss Miller and I decided that we would be here to help you with the task today, that we'd be both on hand to give you assistance with this task, okay? So, that being said, today's lesson is about Tutankhamun's cause of death. The activity that you will be doing today is to become a historian, okay, and work with a variety of sources to determine Tutankhamun's cause of death. Now, to engage with sources, we have to know what sort of sources we should be looking for, shouldn't we? Okay, so can anyone tell me the two types of sources that you engage with in history? In anything, but particularly in history. You know the names of them. They start with a P and they start with an S. Yes, primary and secondary, that is correct. Can anyone give me an example of a primary source? Yes, a photograph, that is correct. What's another example of a primary source? A book. What sort of book though? Okay, so a diary, that's correct. A diary or a letter, yeah. Okay, so a book created or written by someone from that time. That is 100% correct, okay? And that is the difference between a primary and secondary source, okay? Primary sources were created in the time period that you would be looking at, okay? So a primary source from today would be something that was created today, that you recorded happened in your books today, okay? A primary source might be something that happened last week. Still a primary source, okay, because it happened in the time period. As long as you were there and you witnessed that event, it's considered a primary source. But a secondary source, what's a secondary source? What sort of secondary sources do you engage with in history? Okay, yes, that's correct. So a journal article about the event or about the person, about the time or the thing that you were studying. That is correct. What's something else? So a book again, that's another good one. A book about that event, okay? Now secondary sources just mean that they were not written in the time period that their subject matter is about. Okay, so most of the sources that we have about King Tutankhamun, particularly his death, are all from the secondary source range, okay? Because, you know, it happened thousands of years ago. We don't have existing resources, we don't have existing sources that still look at that still survive today, that still look at that time period. No, well, you've made a very good point. There are things that we know exist from being able to, when they excavated and discovered his tomb, that is correct. But when we look at those sorts of sources, that's more telling us things about his burial, okay, about how the afterlife was represented in Egypt, but not really necessarily always about his cause of death. Or at least if they're there, they're not necessarily clear. It's not like someone pointed and wrote on the wall in hieroglyphics, this was the cause of Tutankhamun's death, okay? Which is why historians have conflicting interpretations on the same event, okay? So you can have lots of different historians interpreting the same event differently, okay? And that's what history is all about. It's all about engaging with these different interpretations and trying to find some sort of truth, okay? And it isn't always necessarily going to be truth, okay? Because we can't talk to King Tutankhamun. We can't talk to someone that he lived with, like his sister, his wife, okay? We can't necessarily sit down, well, we definitely cannot sit down and chat to them, okay? So we can never know, just in a concrete manner, we can never really know what happened. All we are left with is the evidence, the sources that we've been left with. And from these sources, we have to determine a truth, an interpretation of the event. Okay? That's what today's lesson will be about. Now, today's lesson will involve you getting on the computers, okay, and looking for sources about the cause of death, King Tutankhamun's death, okay? And we've got some sheets that will be coming around that will help you with that process. But first, before we look at these sheets, I'd just like to ask you, Year 11, what you think makes a credible source. Why is a source that gives you information, why is that information trustworthy? Why is it reliable? Why is it credible? Okay, so just before we start, before you go to the computers, before we go through these activities, I'd just like you to open your books and maybe write one sentence. What makes evidence that someone gives you credible? Okay, and it doesn't need to be necessarily related specifically to ancient Egypt. Okay, it could be, why do you trust that when your friend comes to you and tells you information, why do you trust that that information is true? Why do you trust that information? Why are you willing to act on that information? Okay? Just give you a couple more seconds to do that. What makes information credible? What makes it trustworthy? Okay, just coming back, just quickly. Okay, what makes information trustworthy? What makes a source trustworthy? Yes. Okay, that's right. So you can trust a friend. That's 100% true, because you know that they will hopefully be giving you credible information. That's right. What's another one? Yes. Okay, so if that source was created by an expert, okay, and now we know that in history, experts aren't always academics, okay? They're not always academics, okay? But when we look at academics and those who are also producing sources on, say, history, okay, we know that potentially academics, because they are surrounded by this sort of environment where they have to constantly sort of support their arguments and engage with other academics, right? Not necessarily in the same way that, like, say, someone who wrote a newspaper article would. We know that, in theory, academics' sources, the sources that academics create, so secondary sources, are hopefully going to be giving us more trustworthy information. Now, what's some reasons why a secondary source may not be trustworthy, particularly if it's written by an academic? Yes, okay, so an academic may be writing about a time period, so say Tutankhamun's tomb or his death, but they may not be an ancient historian who looks at who's involved in that time period. They may be looking at Roman history and there's a crossover and they've sort of given their opinion on Tutankhamun's death. It's 100% correct, okay? So, academics sometimes overstep their bounds, okay? So they sometimes give opinions, okay? And these opinions may be founded on evidence, but unless they are truly sort of engaged in that source or in that time period, they might overstep their bounds and give their opinion in a time period that they're not really familiar with, okay? And also, as much as we would like to think that academics are creating information that is trustworthy, it's not always trustworthy. What's one word that you guys keep coming around in history? When we look at historical events, when we look at the people who wrote them, what's one word that keeps coming around, that we keep thinking about, that we always have to consider when we're looking at sources, primary or secondary? It starts with a B. Yes, that's right, bias, okay? So even though an academic might, or even your friend might be creating information that you think is trustworthy, you have to remember that that information is created or has been thought about or developed by a human being, okay? And we're always biased towards one opinion or the other, okay? Now, say for instance, I like the color pink, but you like the color blue. And we had to write a paper on why pink is better than blue, okay? Now, you are biased towards the color blue, but I love pink. So I'm going to be using all this language that talks about how pink is such an amazing color, and you'll be sort of more reserved because, you know, pink's not your favorite color. Now that's a very simple example, okay? And please, I hope that there is no such thing as papers on color. I'm sure there are, okay? But that's just sort of a representation that any information that we engage with, that we find on the internet, that we find in academic journal articles, that we find in newspaper articles, they're all going to be subject to bias. And as historians, it's sometimes you need the skills, you need to be critical of the information that you engage with so that you can read between the lines. So you can see that there is bias, so that you can know of the things that constrict the reliability of information, and you can be critical of it. So you don't have to just blindly accept this information. Okay, that's information literacy, okay? Being able to locate information, being able to evaluate information, so evaluate it for bias, but like evaluate it for credibility, trustworthiness, okay? To work out whether it's really of use to you, whether it's really something that you want to apply, okay? Now, so the first part of this task is, and it's coming around to you now. Yep, here you go. Okay, the first task is the research task. Now this lesson is going to be split over 2 periods, okay? So if you don't get through all of this first sheet today, that's fine, okay? You'll get a little bit of time next lesson to do it.